I got some questions on necessary versus sufficient assumption questions. These are one of the most common problem areas for students. So I'll talk about those a little bit and then get into some actual prep test question examples. So the question was not so much the general theory behind the questions, but how they actually craft them. So I'll cover both just for those who aren't familiar with the background. So there are assumption questions as a general catch-all category, but I believe this is insufficiently precise. There's more depth to it. There's two types of assumption questions. One is necessary assumption, one is sufficient assumption, and they're asking for very different things. Now, I have an article on this I'll share with you in the chat if you want the background, but basically you tell the difference between them based upon the verb in the question stem. Necessary assumption questions have verbs that are synonymous with necessity, like depends upon, requires, and assumes. Sufficient assumption questions, on the other hand, have words and phrases that are synonymous with sufficiency, like allows, enables, follows logically if assumed, and properly inferred if assumed. So the key word in those phrases is the word if, which is your sufficient indicator. Now, necessary assumption questions are best viewed as being a very specific kind of must be true question. Contrary to what some other LSAT prep folks say, I believe they are not asking for new information. They are asking for something that is necessary in order for the argument to work. On the flip side, sufficient assumption questions are asking for new information that, if true, will guarantee the argument 100%, leaving no ambiguity at all. Now, necessary assumption questions and sufficient assumption questions, they do have some overlap because, of course, they are both related to assumptions, but the necessary assumption, you typically want to gravitate towards more moderate language because more moderate language or more moderate ideas are required in order for the argument to work. So let's say that I was able to buy a $1 item. That would require that I had the value of at least 1 penny or 1 quarter or 1 nickel or 1 dime and so on. Now, none of those things in isolation would be sufficient to allow me to buy a $1 item, but it is necessary that I possess the value of a penny or a nickel or a quarter in order to buy a $1 item. Now, on the flip side, it is sufficient to have $100 or $1,000 in order to buy a $1 item, but you don't need to have $1,000 to buy a $1 item. $100 would be sufficient, $10 would be sufficient, and of course, $1 itself would be both necessary and sufficient in order to buy a $1 item. So I think about it like a nuclear warhead would be sufficient to kill a mosquito, but it's certainly not necessary in order to do so. It could be as strong as you want, as long as it gets the job done, if we're looking at it from the sufficient assumption perspective.